SGO of 15%. If you're a non-SGP teacher, you have 2 SGOs, each one being 7.5%. That is going to change moving forward. For next year, all staff will have 2 SGOs. So many of you have probably heard of the idea of a SMART goal, right? That this is not unique to education. This, in fact, didn't originate in education. But the state has said that they want teachers to develop specific, measurable, attainable goals that have that are time-sensitive in nature, based on their students. Meaning, and here's the other twist, for a teacher, they would not be developing the SGO at the end of the year for the next year. Now, I don't normally do this at a board meeting, but why do you think they wouldn't be doing it? So, why would a teacher, at the end of the year, not be setting student growth objectives for the following year? Bingo, yes. So, to answer the question, thank you, Bev, the teachers would not know who their students were for the next year. That's critical because that's another shift in how we set up the summative for the following year. At the summative conference in the past, you were closing out the whole year, creating goals for the next year. You can't do that any longer. You're closing out the year, and then you are saying to the teacher, based on the student groups that you have, by October 30th of the next school year, we're going to develop these student growth objectives. So those aren't going to be developed until the following school year. So now that's another piece that's going to be developed in the next school year. Now again, that would not hold up the calculation of that person's summative at the end of the year if they didn't get an SGP, but it would, of course, be something that the teacher is going to have to attend to with the administrator at the beginning of the school year. So the key here is, think of the SGO simply as this. You're measuring 2 points in time. You're measuring usually a point at the beginning of a unit, beginning of an assignment, and at the end of that unit. You could have a pre and post test. You do not have to. There may be other ways to measure what's happening between those 2 points. Here's an example of an 8th grade language arts specific SGO. So 6 to 8 students who scored in the low range on the pre-assessment will increase 10 words per minute over their baseline score on the oral reading fluency assessment. So what we've done here is we've set a goal, we've set a scoring plan, and then notice we've set, these are the all-important rating, right, the all-important numbers, we've set values within the scoring plan. So that for this teacher, if 7 to 8 students met this goal, when we're following up at the end of the year or at the end of the unit, at the end of the assessment, if I have 7 kids who fell within this range, then that teacher would earn a 4 on the SGO. That's a power button. Matt Paul's not here anymore. Here's a physics. Brian Heineman, Dr. Heineman is here, so he'll appreciate this. 75% of students will meet their designated target scores in the Physics 1 post-assessment. This is what we call a tiered SGO because you have different preparedness groups in this goal. So you see you have a low, a medium, and a high group here. I'll tell you that fewer of our teachers set tiered goals. Most of them had a general goal that looked more like this than this. We had a few. So you take the observation or teacher practice, you take your SGO goals, and if you teach anything else besides grades 4 to 8 language arts and math, you have what makes up your evaluation. However, if you do teach grades 4 to 8 and you teach language arts or math, you're looking at this other component, which again does not come to you until the winter. We're being told January, February of the following school year, meaning your summative evaluation is incomplete. So this is where NJ Ask and Park come into play. Because how are you getting the student growth percentile? Well, you're getting it based on growth that the student exhibits from one year to the next on the state assessment. This is something that you're going to hear more and more about as we give testing presentations. Because remember, I was up here for many, many years talking about proficiency levels on state assessments. And we were very focused on how how many we had in the advanced proficient, how many we had in proficient, and how many in partially proficient. Still important, but now the focus is more on growth. So what type of growth are students exhibiting in the partially proficient range, in the advanced proficient range, and in the proficient range? Is it low? Is it typical growth? Is it high growth? These are the kinds of measures that are becoming more and more prevalent with this system. So again, the issue is it's only for the SGP teachers. And the other thing that we keep wondering is, so you know that this year is the last year of the NJS, and then next year is PARC, right? So we've wondered this aloud as I look at my administrative colleagues, how are they going to account for the change in the assessment from the NJS to the PARC? So you're showing growth in theory from one test to the next. So this will be interesting. I am attending a workshop with some colleagues next week, I believe, and hopefully we'll get some more information on this, on the SGO process, and on the SGP calculation. So to be continued there. Real well. But this is what I wanted to talk to you about briefly, is this whole paradigm shift and being so focused on proficiency level, proficiency level, proficiency level. One of the things that many people ask is when you look at growth scores, they say, well, how does a student with a 300 exhibit growth? You've got a student in 4th grade who gets a 300 on math, and then the next year goes to a 297. Where are they? Is that high growth? Is that low growth? Or is that typical growth? And my answer to you would be, it depends on his or her peer group. So that student, or actually I should be using the student here that we talked about in this example. This student, we've heard this name a lot because this is the example the state uses, is Albert, in this case, gets a 165 on the NJS. So those of you that have followed NJS testing know that's a partially proficient score, right? And in the past, we would say we need to try to help that student to get into the proficiency range, which of course we would still be doing, by the way. But when we now look at that student, he is being lumped in with academic peers who scored in the 165 range. And so what he's done is, he's actually placed, and I know it's hard to see, on this chart from 110 to 200. So 200 being proficient, 110 being one of the lowest scores that you can achieve on the NJS. And when you look at his score, he actually scores or outperformed 70% of his academic peers based on his peer group the prior year. So it's interesting because most of us would say, well, Albert, at a 165, if you just look at his performance in a snapshot, say, well, he needs to improve. And we're certainly still saying that. However, based on the growth model, Albert has outperformed 70% of his peers. So to take that a step further is, when you look at Albert in this teacher's roster, and this is the roster, this is why I don't use my handwriting. But when you look at this teacher's roster, you'll see where Albert falls. So if you look at Albert, Albert actually falls in the higher SGP scores, right? He's a 7. So actually for this teacher, he has the 5th highest SGP score in this class. And if you were to take all of this teacher's SGP scores, this is how the teacher gets their SGP score, or their median SGP score, which, by the way, we got MSG reports this year for our teachers to share with them. They did not count, but we got these to get our staff used to the idea of an MSGP score. What's interesting about this is, you then take this 51, which is the MSGP score of the teacher, and it corresponds on this conversion table to a 3. So remember, when you think about the evaluation, the summative, you now have the teacher practice score, the student growth objective score, and the SGP score. So for this teacher, they would have had a 3. And now I'm taking all of those, and based on the weighting that each has, that I showed you at the beginning in the pie chart, which now feels like 5 hours ago, you could then calculate that teacher's rating. So these are the two examples. I gave, it just is something to think about, to ponder, that you could have a student at 300 in year 1 and 297 in year 2, and they could be labeled as being low growth students, but still be advanced proficient. Right? So in other words, their peer group may have maintained the 300s. They dropped to a 297. It's still a fantastic score. It's a 297. They probably got 1 to 2 questions wrong on the ask. This is a hypothetical, by the way. The other thing to look at, though, is more like the Albert example that I gave you. A student at 170 in year 1 goes to 190. Still be partially proficient, but they made a significant increase. We would like to think some of that has to do with the teacher. So that student will be labeled as a high growth student, but they're still partially proficient. Do you see the shift in thinking based on the SGP versus just the snapshot of the proficiency level? So to tie it in a knot, because I know that all but the hook is being taken out right now. How much time do I have? So the first example is of a highly effective teacher. This is putting it all together. So we take the teacher practice score at 85% and the student growth objective. And these are just scores that I created for our example tonight. If the teacher practice rolls up to a 3.60, the student growth objective to a 3.75, you multiply those by their weights. That gives you then the summative rating score, which if you use the scale at the bottom created by the Department of Ed, that would give this teacher highly effective status. So they are a highly effective teacher. So clearly this teacher is an highly effective teacher, not in any danger of the mandatory inefficiency charges that I mentioned earlier. Second example, again, just to take it out, this is an effective teacher getting a 3.38. And then this would be a partially effective teacher. So you can see that their numbers, you'd be able to predict that, falling below the cutoff for an effective teacher, which is 2.65, puts them in this 2.59 category. That's a partially effective teacher, meaning according to the Department of Education, this teacher has to be put on a corrective action plan in year 1 and has to be observed an additional time. So that's a big change that districts will be going through for next year. So the theme that you'll hear is this whole idea of building capacity. In other words, having the capacity to be able to observe the number of teachers that you have to observe. So it's interesting that there'll actually be, if districts stay with the same system they've had and the same number of observations, there'll be more next year for all districts in New Jersey. Because the assumption is that some districts are bound to have teachers with either partially effective or ineffective ratings, meaning all of those teachers go to 4 observations instead of 3. So the thing that gets lost in all this is that we also observe administrators in a similar way. And I just wanted to very briefly touch on the administrators. Very briefly touch on that. We also use a rubric for our administrators. Kim Marshall, although it's interesting that the Department of Education does not require a rubric for our supervisors or directors. It requires it only for principals and assistant principals, but that all of those positions still must receive a final end-of-the-year rating and must be observed 3 times, regardless of tenure status. It might be too late for this, but I'm going to try it anyway. This is the formula for determining the principal and the assistant principal evaluation. This could be a whole separate presentation. But notice, if you just stay with me, that for the administrators, this whole idea of practice score is still there. So you still have the observation instrument being used, but also the superintendent is going to evaluate them with another rubric that the state mandates. So it's an additional rubric that all superintendents have to use on top of the Danielson framework that we adopted. That's a requirement. That then gets averaged in with the SGO average in the building. All the SGO scores from all the teachers are averaged together. Goals that are set by the administrator, which are similar to the SGO. And then all principals in Berners Township, except for the high school principal, have this school SGP. That's an average of all it's a median of all the language arts and math SGP scores. So the only one not subject to this is Ridge High School. What's that? Right, no fourth grade. Why? Yes. Yeah. Oh, you were asking me why. Good, someone's paying attention. Good. Yeah. So the reason, right, the high school, just to reiterate that, high school is not an SGP school. There are no 4 through 8 language arts or math teachers in the building. Therefore, there is no school-wide SGP. Right. 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 You just make this work for them. Yeah. So, Preeti, there are no language arts math teachers who teach grades 4 to 8. There's no test at the high school level. No NJASC. It's based on the NJASC scores. So because there are not the high schools don't have. Right. PARC, they don't use PARC at the high school. So PARC is not used to derive growth scores yet. Not saying it's not coming. That's one of my speculation statements at the end. No, it doesn't. It's just that the state is not using it for SGP calculation yet. That relates to the recent news slide. Let me get to that in a moment. Right. This, I'll let you peruse this on your own. This is the breakdown of the calculation of the different buildings. I'll just point here because because Preeti brought it up. In the case of Ridge High School, the makeup of, or the breakdown of the evaluation for that principal and assistant principal, 40% is the SGO average, 10% is the administrator goal, 20% is the evaluation leadership, and then the observations are 30%. We do not have a single grade SGP principal. We don't have that in Burnham Township. This is everyone else. Okay, this is everyone else. This is Annie, and this is the 4 elementary. Okay, so you know we're in the home stretch. The recent news, this is something that I was, I try to follow what's happening in education in New Jersey because one of the things that's interesting is that we also feel like, Mr. Boo, where we're staying just one step ahead of our students, if you will, or in this case, the Department of Education. Because things have changed quite frequently this year, and I have to say that, and really, I've said this a couple of times, our staff, our administrators have done such a good job of flexing and making the most out of this for themselves professionally. They really have gotten a tremendous amount out of this. But now, as I'm looking at the closeout of this year, we're seeing something that just moved through the Education Assembly in New Jersey. That is the call to delay this whole idea of SGPs for at least 2 years. Now, this is just out of the Education Committee. Hasn't even gone through Assembly yet. It hasn't even gone to the Governor yet. Or the Senate. This is preliminarily, but I wanted to mention it because it literally just came out last week. What the bill would call for is to set up a task force to look at the Common Core standards and also the cost of PARC. So it isn't just calling into question the SGP calculation. It's also calling into question how different they want. Here's what they actually want to do. They want to look at and take the core content curriculum standards, compare them to the Common Core, and do a thorough investigation. Now, interestingly enough, our administrators have already done it, right? So it's interesting. We've done it. Our language arts administrator, our supervisor, our math supervisor, Dr. Hyman, the other administrators, we've done it already. So the state, though, wants to step back and take a look at this because they're hearing from districts that it's costing a tremendous amount of money, as Mr. Marcari's talked about this year, in terms of getting the district prepared for the PARC assessment. So, meanwhile, they're also saying that maybe we should look at the validity of the SGP calculation because we may be questioning the whole PARC assessment. So, again, we are marching forward until we're told otherwise. But that is something that may change. So, last but not least, some of the things we learned this year. Again, I mentioned this earlier, and this is really important for me personally, professionally this summer, is to focus on trying to reduce administrator bias. My colleagues and I have had a lot of discussions about this. How do we really know which specific components to look at when we go into a classroom? Can we standardize that process a little bit more? Because remember, the spirit of every district adopting a research-based rubric was to try to reduce bias. So with training and familiarity, that bias will be reduced, but that's going to take some time. The other thing is, just from a more technical standpoint, we've all had some growing pains using the software, which is TeachGate. I have to say, they've gotten a lot better. We've experienced a lot more success, and the system itself does what it's designed to do. It does collect the observation really efficiently. The last thing is, and my administrative counterparts across the state can attest to this, is just this idea of building capacity to be able to observe all of these teachers, because you had, in many, many districts, the number of observations reduced dramatically for districts. So all of the administrators district-wide saw an increased observer load. Again, to their credit, one of the positives is, of course, it got us into the classrooms more, which is a real positive feature of this. But we now are seeing the possible increase, obviously, with the number of caps in the district. So depending upon the number of corrective action plans, that's one additional per staff member on top of the number of observations we already have to do. So the good thing about it is, and the positive is, and what the state intended is, that administrators are in the classrooms more and seeing teacher practice and giving feedback. Obviously, it becomes taxing for some administrators, and I'm speaking generally, not for Township, but for administrators across the state who have to observe 3 to 5 times more staff than they had in the past, depending upon the number of staff in the district. So that's a snapshot, that view, and I hope that you were able to take some pieces away from that. I know that my DAC members in the group could have done that presentation, but I hope I did justice. Thank you. If anybody has any, you don't have any. Yeah, okay. Any questions? Oh, good. Yes.
What are the board criteria?
Or?
The board. It doesn't seem like you have the criteria for the board.
The board. You mean the board to evaluate teachers?
No, the board to evaluate itself.
That's not related to this at all. No, this is strictly. I'm sorry,
Well,
Chris.
that was my first comment. My second one is I should have gone to the van.
What did I?
But that's not going to work.
See, I told you when I saw you today you were going to say. Well, as I said, the invitation is always open
Well, I
to
was
come in.
a nice job, but I was making fun.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Great to hear.
This year you're having all the assessments and you're going into the classroom and implementing it. So what have you learned from doing all of that? Have you figured anything out district-wide?
Well, one of the things we'll do, and I've started to do, is we're writing those reports to see what components folks are scoring a lot. So what it's going to give you very globally is I could look at a building. I could take one building in the district, and I could look at the average score of a specific component. So for instance, that one that I chose, questioning strategies. And if I see variances, pretty severe variances, and again, I evolved in one building, then it allows me to look at all the teachers in the building and try to figure out, where are we seeing that? Are we seeing it at a grade level? Do we need to do some professional development at a specific grade level on eliciting higher order questioning strategies? And again, that's just an example. I'm not saying that's a problem. But yeah, that's going to allow you. No. End of the year, right? So now that we have all the data.
You've had a few, you must have had a few if you're doing
The reports function has only become available in the last few weeks. Yeah. But as I mentioned, these are some of the things we're working on. I think the only way to make this system more meaningful for teachers is for us to be, both teachers and administrators, to become more and more comfortable with the system. Right? There was this feeling out process with the rubric the first year. I still think, I'd like to think we're a year ahead of things though, because our administrators have used this now for 2 years, where you've had other districts in the state who were only using it for the first year this year. And so we've done a couple of years worth of professional development on this. And by the way, I should mention, since she was here tonight, Kiara, the Teacher of the Year, is one of our instructional coaches who has worked countless number of hours with teachers. One of her responsibilities is to help with this process. So in other words, if teachers need some additional assistance with the rubric and understanding it, she'll go and work with them on it before an observation so they understand it. Yeah, that's one of the functions of the coach. Yes, please.
This is very interesting, and I guess I'm
Oh,
wondering
good.
when we'll actually get, what kind of information will we get as a board at, what you found? At some point, I know you're going to have to look at all the numbers and figure things out, but are we going to see things by building, or can we see examples at some point? Not obviously names, but of what these things look like. I think that would be
with the evaluation committee, with the district evaluation committee, some global reports on what we're seeing in buildings. But more importantly, what we're going to get, at least right now, is these SGP reports. So we're going to get them by building. And if you remember, and I almost had a slide on it, actually I had a slide, I took it out, is on the school performance reports, right? Because now there's a growth measure in those performance reports. So just because you brought it up from a building standpoint, you're going to see those measures more and more, those growth measures. And we'll also be sharing some of the reports with the as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that leads into my question. Have we run any running reports at all yet?
Just some for, I ran a couple at DIAC, at our most recent district evaluation.
The one you showed, does ours look similar, or do we have more on the right side? That's what I think we wanted to know.
We had very little in the wet area of ones and twos in the
That's
district. Very little.
Okay.
Yeah, if you were just looking at something very quickly, and that's what I did, in every building, there was a very, very low number of ones and twos. Very low. Right.
Well, that's good. And then one other quick question, this was back from the beginning, where you're going to affirm interview rate or reliability, meaning everyone doing evaluations is consistent.
Correct.
How do you do that?
Well, that's a question, and that's why I have it as the observer bias. That's that first point there. That, and I've been saying this all year, that's one of the most difficult things when you use a rubric. Any rubric. Even a teacher, an administrator, when you have a rubric, continual training is necessary. And one of the things, and one of the nice things about our summer is we spend a lot of time in discussions about this. And so we'll look at actual observations of staff members, and we'll pick each other's brains and try to anchor some of the scores, just like we do with holistic scoring. Why did you score this a 3 and support it? We'll be doing a lot of that. But at the end of the day, you cannot eliminate the human element in any of this. So we're going to have, certainly next to close perfection in terms of everybody applying it equally, but you still cannot eliminate the human element.
And I laughed because you said that was one of the nice things about your summer, so I'm really sorry.
Yeah, that is. Yep, no vacation period. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have to go back to the superintendent's report. We're a little bit out of order in the agenda. Can I have a motion to move items 1 and 2? For Elaine, wait a second. Roll call, please. Does anyone have any questions?
I just have a comment that the HIB report doesn't tell you much except numbers. I almost don't want to vote on it. I saw something that nobody understands.
Okay, roll call.
Mr. Byrne?
I have to admit that the HIB was submitted, and I saw it, I don't know what it says. Yes.
Mrs. Swarner?
On the teachers of the year and HIB.
Yeah.
Dr. Vera?
Yes.
Mrs. Cassell?
Yes.
Mrs. McGowan?
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw?
Yes.
Mrs. Richmond?
Yes.
Mrs. Holdridge?
Yes.
Mrs. McHugh?
Yes. We're now up to public forum on agenda items. If anyone has any comments that they would like to make on anything on the agenda, please come forward and put your name and address on the clipboard. Okay, I don't think anyone's coming up, so I will close public forum on agenda items. We're up to approval of minutes. Someone like to make a motion? Karen? Susan, second.
Mr. Byrne?
Yes.
Mrs. Warner,
Yes.
Dr. Beer,
Yes.
Mrs. Cassell,
Yes.
Mrs. McGowan,
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw,
Yes.
Mrs. Richmond,
Yes.
Mrs. Holdridge,
Yes.
Mrs. McKee,
Yes. Okay, Item 12 is annual appointments. There are 8 of them. Would someone like to make a motion on items 1 to 8? Bev?
Can I ask questions?
After,
Yeah.
Bev?
I move items 1 through 8 on the appointments.
Would you like a second? Okay. Katie?
I just hope somebody is going through all these field trip destinations before we just approve them all. Some of these destinations I've never heard of, nor have I heard of any student going to any student groups, which they could have been. I just want to make sure that somebody is taking more responsibility in the fact of
Most of them are ones that they've gone before. I recognize almost
Yeah,
all of them.
I know,
Are there any particular ones?
like, I'm sure there's some I recognize, but there's some I don't know why they're doing it, or just somebody else should be checking it other than, I think, us.
We process those trips every time they take the trip every year. There's a submission form and a bunch of documents that the people that want to take the trip have to submit first to their supervisor and or principal, and then I have to sign off on it too. So I do look at them every single time that they come
You
through.
do?
I do.
I don't want to be the reason.
No, I mean, you know, it's the destination. What I'm checking for is to make sure that the reason that they're taking the trip looks appropriate and that they have enough staff going to supervise the number of students.
Are these all new, have these all been taken before, all these trips? Yes.
Any other comments or questions?
I probably agree with everybody's questions. What do we do?
Okay, can we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Byrne,
Yes.
Mrs. Warner,
Yes.
Dr. Beer,
Yes.
Mrs. Cassell,
Yes.
Mrs. McGowan,
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw,
Yes.
Mrs. Richmond,
Yes.
Mrs. Holdridge,
Yes.
Mrs. McKee,
Yes. We're up to committee reports. We have finance. Would someone like to make a motion to move items 1 through 30?
I'd like to move items 1 through 30 on finance.
Second, Susan? Can I ask questions? First, Elaine, did you say anything first?
I think I discussed most of these in the minutes. A lot of them are things that we do every year, approving different parent groups that we use for, we also, parent groups that operate in our buildings. Also, we're appointing, we're doing our usual professional development expenses for certain people. We're also appointing our newspaper of record, legal counsel. These are the things we do annually. One is we have a risk management consultant that we're appointing, treasurer of school monies, we put the tax levies in here as well, and our health insurance. I guess another notable one is our health insurance, major medical and prescription drug plans are on the agenda here as well. And I guess of note also, we are rejecting the bids that we received for the WAMS Foods Room and Ridge Wellness Center projects. And those have already gone out to rebid on Friday, and I won't get into the details, but we've made a lot of changes in the specifications to try to get the cost of the projects down, and we're pretty confident that we're going to be able to do that. We're going to get those, I believe, at the bids will be due on June 3rd, and we will, assuming we get acceptable bids, we can consider them at our June 9th meeting. Another notable item on the agenda is we're submitting to the State Department of Education a plan, authorization. We're giving our architect the authority to submit a plan for the WAMS entryway. And this is in the middle school. We have basically an open door right now. There's a door, and you get buzzed in, but then you can immediately go into the rest of the school without being stopped. And what we'd like to do is have another door that sort of keeps you in the middle until we know where you're going and you're approved to go there. Our PTO, the Williams PTO has generously donated $10,000 for this. However, the true costs are going to be more because we have to pay for the cameras and the electronics and other things. So we do need to figure out what to do about the cost, but all we're doing right now is just approving the submission of the project to the State Department. Any questions?
About the rebidding, I did read it, not that I need to know every detail, but just what was changed. Because my concern is we're losing some functionality or some safety issue.
I can speak to that briefly, but Rod can certainly tell us. Really, the main issues were this HVAC system in the wellness center. We were going to really, and our architect is here as well, who could answer any questions. If you'd like to get more detail, I think that was the main one, and we're doing some work behind the scenes in the WAMS foods room. Nothing would look different to the students, and they wouldn't have any different experience. It's just things that no one can see.
That's essentially correct. There was a lot of value in engineering plans to that redesign of it. So, when we walk into these spaces, the differences will be perceptible from what the curriculum is expecting to get out, what you're expecting to get out now. But one of the things that was trying to look at the plans again and see, well, how can we facilitate shorter runs, which means less copper, less wire, too wire. So we started adding up those things and thought there was something that was working, certain work to us. This budget, but the HVAC system.
So I think HVAC system in a stinky exercise room is important.
It hasn't been on, okay, I think that.
Because the reason I say this is there's a room that the wrestlers use, and that room I have been in after they've left, and that smell doesn't go away.
Unfortunately, that's not on this bid, but that's a project out there, certainly.
So what I'm saying is HVAC in an exercise room, I feel is extremely important, so I'm concerned when you're reducing it or not using it or using some part of it. I'm very
What
concerned.
you're doing is upgrading, you're putting brand new aerial systems in, which actually are more energy efficient and more effective in the system that you currently have. So they are upgrading the system, but when you look at what was designed originally, it was beyond the scope of what would be encompassed within what the original budgetary estimates were.
I just want to make sure there will still be normal breathing air.
That's certainly the intention. I think, Tony, can you?
This is
Tony's
the
that
bottom.
is here from our.
All right.
Yeah, I don't know, I don't know. The system that's there now handles the weight room as it is, and it's not as bad as the wrestling room or most, my son's a high school student, these things too, at any sport he participates in, but, and don't look at his sock work, because that's really terrible. The idea here, and I want to say we kind of overdid it with that in mind, and that's one of the reasons it was over budget, is we tried to give you a state-of-the-art system, and I think we overdid that. So we cut it back down to something that was simpler, and within the budget. And that's the key is to get back on budget.
All right. So you think it still will be fine?
It's fine now, so I'm sure we'll be fine with the improvements.
Well, we're expanding it, right? So doubling it?
Well, the
Oh, there's a new system in the other,
The new
in the other
space.
room, completely new system in the other room.
Oh.
So the overall capacity is going to be increased to accommodate the additional square footage.
I want to comment on that same bid. I think we hired a facilities manager, among other things, to review plans. And exactly the exact number is, but we came in at $1.1 million, and I think we have to be down around 600,000. So we're way over the estimate. And thanks to the architect, Tony, and Dave, our facility manager, they worked on this thing, and there was a gas line, and they disconnected the gas line so it doesn't have gas in it anymore. So we didn't have to take it out. It was going to be that. And many, many things like that that had nothing to do with the function of the building or the facilities. I want to congratulate Tony and Dave and Rod, for that matter, for that kind of a reduction. And I think that's the reason we hired and created the job for a facility manager. And I think we ought to allow time in any of these jobs because this is going to pay for itself. If they're able to save $400,000 or $500,000 on this rush first pass design, I think we want to review all the designs with the hope of saving 20–30%. Because the function is identical. So I want to congratulate the team. I think they did a great job.
Thank you.
Oh, and the restroom room, you have to keep it hot because the kids are wrestling and they don't have a lot of clothes on.
Any other comments? Do we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Byrne?
Yes.
Mrs. Smart?
Yes.
Dr. Beer?
Yes.
Mrs. Cassell?
Yes.
Mrs. McGowan?
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw?
Yes.
Mrs. Richmond?
Yes.
Mrs. Wooldridge?
Yes.
Mrs. McHugh?
Yes. Okay, we're up to personnel. I have a motion to approve items 1 through 31. There's a couple on this addendum.
I move items 1 through 30 for personnel.
Second.
Any questions?
What are 29? I'm sorry, 30 and 31.
Actually, I have a question about 30. I thought we discussed this.
That's this year.
Oh, that's this year. Okay.
Yeah.
We're good.
Any other people?
Could you explain wraparound construction?
Yes, that was a pilot program we did this year for students who did not score as well as they could on the NGS. They had the opportunity to come to school, I believe it was before school, for additional instruction. Unfortunately, the level of interest was very low, so the pilot's not going to be continued after this year.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Roll call, please.
Mr. Byrne?
I'm still, the minutes came out.
They came out, I was asked that they be delivered to you.
Okay. Today,
Unfortunately, we met last Friday, so they came out this morning, but you should have them.
okay. Yes.
Mrs. Smart?
Yes.
Dr. Beer?
Yes.
Mrs. Cassell?
Yes.
Mrs. McGowan?
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw?
Yes.
Mrs. Richmond?
Yes.
Mrs. Wooldridge?
Yes. We're up to policy.
Just one more item for personnel. I would just like to remind all my student colleagues that superintendent evaluation feedback must be in by the 26th of May. Unfortunately, there's no time for extensions because the county office has an interval where they need to tabulate and compile the data before it comes back to me to pick it up. It's the 26th of May. Yeah. On the 9th of June, we will be discussing the preliminary report in executive session, just as the board. Well, it's Memorial Day, yeah. I mean, I could have made the deadline that Friday, but I'm giving you through the weekend. It's very tight timeline.
Why isn't there a discussion at the board level in closed session?
That's-
The superintendent's
That's what
report.
we're going to be doing on the
But
9th.
if you already submit the numbers to the county,
No, we didn't, that's just submitting, Mike, the online form has to go to the county, and then they give it back to us, and Bev is gonna compile it, and then we talk about
but
it.
if we haven't even talked about it, it seems stupid to me.
But it doesn't go to anyone yet, we make a report after.
I think we're agreeing, and we don't understand we agree, on the 9th of June, in executive session, just the board, not any of the administrators, just the board is going to go over a preliminary report of the data that was compiled, discuss it before the final report is prepared.
Does it get sent to the county?
Oh, absolutely not. It doesn't get sent to the county until we review it with the superintendent.
So
And
the
that's fine.
26th, the county
May
date,
26th, your individual feedback has to be in by May 26th. The county compiles it and then gives it to me as the chair of personnel. I look at it and take the compiled feedback and write a preliminary draft evaluation. The board as a group is meeting on the 9th of June without the administrators, just the board, to discuss the draft report. It will then be edited to reflect the opinions of the board, and it will be reviewed with the superintendent on the 23rd of June, and once that is done, it will be submitted to the county.
now, but it is submitted to the county on the
It's
26th.
just the online form, because it's their online form, they have to give it back to us. Do you know what I mean?
Well, it seems,
It's not the county, it's the school board.
School boards.
The school board.
Yeah,
They do the service to
Right.
compile the data for us.
but they're not doing anything. with it.
even before we've talked about it.
I think,
It's just an online form.
It's just an
I think-
online survey.
no, I think I understand. I understand where Mike is coming from. So I think what happened, I, for example, like the first one to do it, Beth?
I think-
I don't know, I think Robin might be.
So, I filled it out, and I think the only thing that happens is, what I fill out goes to somebody, and exactly as I submitted it goes to Bev. So what Bev gets is 9 reports that we individually did, stapled together more or less, electronically. And then that's discussed.
Now, I guess
So
I'm arguing,
the county just staples or.
I'm arguing this.
Somebody just staples it together, that's all they do.
Well, that seems like something stupid.
No, they don't just staple together, they compile all the questions they tabulate it on one form, so that all the board's answers for that question get on one form, and then it gets to the next one. It gets consolidated.
The School Board Association office is purely providing us with a service. It's an online form that goes into this data collection mechanism that spits it back out. so we can-
But the discussion of the board members might influence whether I think it's a good job or a bad job. I want to hear the input from the rest of the board members and to have what I initially write down, which might not be correct because it's only my opinion, to have that go to somebody and come back as, it just seems like many of the things that we've talked about tonight. I'm having trouble with the rigor of all of this stuff, and it just doesn't make sense. So that's my opinion.
Is it correct though that this is, my understanding is that in this age of electronics, the only thing that's happening electronically is it's actually not being looked at by anybody, rather a machine compiles the questions, lumps them together. So actually, I think, Mike, your point is you'd like there to be a discussion, then we individually put them in. And then we discuss it again as a group. Well, that's.
I think that could be something to note for future years then. Unfortunately, the ship has sailed for this year, and it's the same way we did it the previous year as well. But I think what you're suggesting is maybe in future years, we have an executive session to discuss the objectives of it before we go online to fill out.
I think last year I didn't do it. I think Susan did it for me.
No, you filled it out manually. Susan did not do it for you, Mike. You filled it out manually, and I did the keying in for you, so that, because you don't do computers. Let's make that clear. He doesn't do computers. So I did that
I'm
service.
still using Lotus 1, 2,
But it was all your answers that I put into the computer.
Well, last year I would have liked to have had discussion as well.
Well, we had discussion when they all came back compiled. We had an executive session where we all went through the results, talked about the majority and the minority opinion, and agreed on what the final written result would be.
I don't think individual opinions without discussion. I think the board is a board and they should be discussing these things before we send it to anybody and compile it. I think the object should be, what does the board think, and the chance to hear each one's
I'm
opinion.
so glad you're saying that, Mike, because that's exactly why we're meeting on the 9th of June, to discuss.
But in the meantime, I'm gonna have to make a judgment.
Look, I
which is
think that
gonna
a
go
lot of
somewhere.
your everyone's opinion, and I don't think if we met and talked about it beforehand, some board members might think we were trying to impose our opinion on them, and they wouldn't get to say what they thought, they might be influenced by that. I think your opinion is what matters, and that's why it's going there, and then we'll discuss, we'll all discuss our opinions.
I'm gonna try and do it tomorrow, depends on what the questions are. If the questions are tough, I may not do it until we have a discussion.
Well, just understand that after the 26th, the data is in. Our discussion.
Well, see, wait a minute, that's what I'm saying, the data is in, and that's stupid as far as I'm concerned.
The initial data is in from each board member.
But it doesn't count for anything.
It does, it's an individual opinion from each board member that's going to be formed into a majority document, which will then be discussed and modified.
Can't
in
I do
executive
that on
session.
June 9th and say, here's my
Well,
opinion?
part of the rating, if you'll remember from what you did last year, is there's actually a numeric component to the rating on how objectives have been met. And in order to come up with the final numeric rating, we need to average all the numbers that have come in. So if you choose not to do a numeric rating before the 26th, then it's not part of the average.
Fine, I haven't changed my position one little bit,
And Mike,
but I respect your opinion.
I just want to point out that one of the choices when you're filling out the numeric part is not observed. So if you feel like you don't have enough information, or you weren't on a committee and got to see one aspect of what it does, you can put not observed, and that's not positive or negative, it just means you don't have the information to observe it. So, especially with new board members, that they would have to put not observed for things that they haven't observed yet. So, there is an option on there, you don't have to fill out an answer that you don't want to.
It just seems to be a total contradiction to me.
Do all the board members have to, or need to, I should say, are all the board members required to enter something in the system? Or can we have one board member, like, chooses not to, will that, how does that affect the overall process?
Probably would be fine.
I don't know. I wonder, is there,
Technically, is every board member supposed to enter something?
Yes, everyone's supposed to do it. I don't think that, I don't know what happens. So does
I hear
everyone,
one
or
from
even,
school boards would come to us and say,
why did somebody do it? She
I
didn't
didn't.
know who did it. So.
If somebody doesn't do it, then they don't submit their input for the,
I can still comment on the 9th.
is it a requirement in school board? They can come after you if you get it. We didn't do it for all these.
I'm not worried about the school board.
I mean, the district has to do a review, but if a board member chooses not to participate by not answering the survey, then they're just not part of the opinion. Yeah.
Board members should be entitled not to provide an opinion.
No.
You don't want to, but it's part of your job, it's your wife's job as a board member.
Report. Okay, do we have any other questions
Everybody in the
about
audience totally
policy?
asleep here.
Personnel.
Oh, I'm sorry. We're still, oh, we voted on it already. Okay, so now we're up to policy. We need a motion to move number 1.
All right, I'll move to number 1.
There's just one, right? Elaine, did you second it? Okay, Elaine seconded it. Susan. Any questions? Okay, can we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Burke,
Yes.
Mrs. Smart,
Yes.
Dr. Beer,
has met twice in May. I'll just do a rundown of topics we talked about. Our first meeting was on 5/5. That meeting we spent reviewing the 2008 draft of the mandatory random drug testing policy. Mr. Markarian went through that with the committee so that we would understand and clarify for us the process and the procedures that would take place under a mandatory random drug testing. We had a lot of discussion, and we had procedural and data finding questions raised during the discussion regarding what districts with this policy in effect are experiencing. During that meeting, we also looked at a proposed policy for passive breath alcohol sensor device, which is a breathalyzer that would be used to screen students before, during, and after school activities and events. The policy draft provides for an option to screen every pupil participating in the event or to screen on a random basis. The breathalyzer can also be used for screening based upon a report to a school designee that a pupil is suspected of being under the influence of alcohol on school property or at a school function. If it's used in this manner, the testing must comply with policy 5530, which is the suspicion-based testing for substance abuse. The committee requested information on costs and how other districts were using this policy and their experiences. In our 5/12 meeting, there was a follow-up in that Mr. Markarian found that no other district in Somerset County has reported this policy in use. However, instead, there are some that have the police come to the events and administer breathalyzers on a random basis. Mr. Markarian is still investigating the procedure for the breathalyzer use, and we're going to look at that when we meet again in June, hopefully. Like a comment, Tony?
I'm sorry, just to clarify, I think the folks that are having police come to their event, I'm not sure that they're actually bringing breathalyzers to the event. I think what they were saying was that in lieu of having their way of managing a student that they think might be under the influence of alcohol is to have police there to help deal with it. I'm not sure.
Oh, they were using breathalyzers.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the police are actually coming with breathalyzers. They may be. I just want to clarify that.
Okay.
I'm not sure exactly that the police are standing there breathalyzing the students. I just want to clarify that. Thank you, though.
Okay, and then we also received copies for the committee to look at on the different policies that other districts have in effect for mandatory random drug testing. So then on our 5/12 meeting, we reviewed a draft policy on what a voluntary random drug testing program would look like. And in that review, I've also sent out in the minutes a chart that kind of compared the two policies. You want me to do a rundown on it, or? Okay. So I tried to pick out some broad categories, and then I looked at how it would be carried out under mandatory and how it would be carried out under voluntary. So the first category was policy development considerations. Under a mandatory random drug testing, you have to develop the policy consistent with the U.S. Supreme Court and the New Jersey Supreme Court rulings that have come down on the drug testing. Under random drug testing policy, we can develop that within the district guidelines in consultation with our board attorney. It's not, we don't have to be as strict on, because it's voluntary, we're doing it when people signing up. So who would be eligible for testing? Under a mandatory policy, students who participate in athletics or co-curricular activities who possess an on-campus parking permit or who volunteer to participate in the program with parental consent would be eligible for the testing. Under a voluntary program, students who volunteer to participate in the program with parental consent would be in the pool. There is a submission of a consent form. Under a mandatory program, a consent to test form must be submitted by a designated deadline at the start of the school year for all students eligible for testing. Under a voluntary program, consent to test forms can be submitted at any time throughout the school year for any student who wishes to volunteer to participate in the program. Consequences for failure to submit the consent form. Under mandatory program, the consequence would be ineligibility for participation in athletics, co-curricular activities, or for parking on campus. Under a voluntary program, there would be none. The period of eligibility for testing. Under a mandatory program, students remain eligible for random drug testing from the date of the consent form unless they opt out by submitting a withdrawal form with parental consent. If the student no longer participates in athletic or co-curricular activities or parks on campus, they can withdraw from the program, and there's a built-in 15-day grace period for reconsideration. Under a voluntary program, students who volunteer to be in the testing pool will remain in the pool unless they choose to opt out by submitting a withdrawal form with parental consent at any time. And we talked about a possibility of a 48-hour delay to process that withdrawal. Students who are exempt. Under a mandatory program, students who do not participate in athletic co-curricular activities or park on campus, or those who opt out by submitting a withdrawal form, would be exempt from the testing. Under a voluntary program, any student who does not sign up for the program will be exempt from the testing. Opt-out consequences. Under mandatory, students who opt out of the program by submitting a withdrawal form with parental consent will be ineligible for participation in athletics, co-curricular activities, or for parking on campus. Under a voluntary program, once voluntarily enrolled in the program, students may opt out at any time by submitting the withdrawal form with parent approval. Students who opt out of the voluntary program can continue to participate in all athletic and co-curricular activities, as well as park on campus. The procedures for confidentiality, selection, collection, notification of testing to parents, and testing results would be the same as the policies we had looked at for both mandatory and voluntary. The consequences for a first positive under a mandatory program were proposed as removal from qualifying athletics, co-curricular activities for 2 weeks. Parking permit will be revoked for the remainder of the academic year. A physician must evaluate participant before he or she can be reinstated. Student will have a minimum of 3 counseling sessions with the student assistant counselor. The SAC will initiate referral for further evaluation if necessary, and the student must submit a negative drug test prior to returning to any extracurricular activities. For the voluntary program, this was part of our discussion during our committee. It could be the same, it could be just notification to the parent, or it could be something different we could develop within the district. The consequences for a second positive under a mandatory program is removal from qualifying athletic or co-curricular activity for 30 days, revoked parking for remainder of enrollment in high school, referral for substance abuse evaluation, and asked to follow recommendations. Under voluntary policy, it could be the same or something different. And consequences for the third positive test is removal under mandatory, is removal from any qualifying athletic or co-curricular activity for 1 year, referral for substance abuse evaluation, and asked to follow recommendations. And under voluntary, once again, it could be the same or it could be something different as we develop it. The right of appeal, there's a procedure for a request for a retest of specimen under both the mandatory and the voluntary. And another point that we did briefly mention on the policy would be a reporting program or a reporting process of the results to the board and the community so that the program could be monitored for its effectiveness, and we could develop a process under both mandatory and voluntary for that reporting. And then we also talked about at our next meeting, as a follow-up in June, Mr. McCarran was going to reach out to some representatives from some of the districts that do have mandatory policies so that they would come in and speak with the committee members, and we could follow up on some of our questions on the procedure and the effectiveness in their districts. And we'd also ask for a report on some of the caseload information of our student assistant counselors at the high school to get a determination on what kind of cases they're seeing at the high school as relating to drug and alcohol use. And then we also had some policy alerts for Charles Esme that we didn't have a chance to look at, which maybe we'll be able to touch on in June. If not, it'll come eventually. And we were also looking at discussion of the e-cigarette issues. And we didn't have time to touch on that, but that will be a follow-up at another meeting as well. Full meetings.
Thank you to the policy committee and to Nick for all the work that you've been doing, and to Linda and Lane and everyone else who's been researching, and to Linda for typing up documents. Okay, Mike.
I'd like to ask a question. On the consequences, first, second, and third positive reading, the mandatory testing, is that the minimum consequence, or could they be reduced? In other words, the consequences look like the same ones we were looking at 5 years ago. Could we change those and have more flexibility? So these could be changed. This is not law, it's fine.
You're right, this is exactly the policy as proposed in 2008 that I compared it to.
So we have some flexibility there. And suspicion testing, that continues under any of these programs. If you have a drug testing program, random testing, and you have a suspicion case, is that treated the same way as random? In other words, are the police still at arm's length, or at this point, suspicion testing, are the police involved? Whether it's a random program, mandatory or not.
It's random, it's not suspicious.
Random would mean you got called down random just because your number got pulled.
But
But if they were suspicious, then they called you down on suspicion.
so under either of these plans, under a mandatory or a
The
non-mandatory.
suspicion would still be the same, suspicion based on the way it is now.
Okay.
I just wanted to share that we are looking into possibly changing suspicion base just to,
We were talking about the consequences, I think,
Yeah, the
not the way it
consequences.
works. so.
not the way it works, just the consequences, because then it needs to work with this.
Because it's suspicion-based, if all the kids know who's using the drugs, the teachers probably do too. Maybe we want to strengthen that suspicion-based program. That was a good report, I like that.
Thank you. So, Linda, if anyone has comments or wants to give some input on some of the consequences and considering with the voluntary program, we'd be interested in hearing that from the committee.
I just have a question. I know that of at least one district, there's a voluntary policy for the middle school. And I was wondering if you reached out to them to see what their experience has been with that policy. I think it's Warren Hills,
Good idea.
because that would give you some additional information.
Yeah, the one thing with the mandatory is that the law does specify it's grades 9 to 12 specifically, so if we were going younger than that, that'd be the voluntary.
So you could have two programs, you could have a voluntary in the middle school and a mandatory.
No, I'm just pointing it out.
No, I understand.
The only kind you
I
can
understand
have.
middle school, but it's also a voluntary policy.
Right,
So it would be interesting to see how that would work.
right.
Just in general.
I got that.
I think they said they had a very high participation rate,
I know they have a very
90% or something. But
And I think they also have a mandatory policy at the high school too.
Does anybody else have questions or comments?
Your microphone's not
It's
on.
not working? Yeah. Any other questions?
No, it's working.
Anything that you want the policy committee to look at or anything? I'm very interested in the consequence part, whether the consequences make sense, especially between the suspicion based and the, and, any random test.
talked about that. I think that was something that was, I was sitting in, so I'm not a full-time member, but that was something that I think everyone was concerned about, and we wanted to make sure that this is something that's a positive for students versus something that, you know, brings them back away from school and away from participation in things. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Okay, we're up to curriculum.
The curriculum committee hasn't met since our last meeting, but we are meeting this coming Thursday.
For advocacy, I think I reported last time, and we haven't met again. I just wanted to mention that we did meet with Parents for Substance-Free Kids last week. The three of us met, and we had a good conversation with them. And Linda and I are going to the community task force tomorrow afternoon. Yeah, I'm excited, guys. We're up to liaison reports. Linda?
Yeah, I have the municipal alliance liaison report from May 6th. So, we actually several different things were discussed. The first item was, and I know this was in the notes, but Carol Bianchi, Giorgio, and Caitlin Cordosky met with Jerry Colavecchio from the Safe Communities Coalition of Hunterdon and Somerset. And currently, they have several high schools in Hunterdon County that are participating in their Safe Homes program, and they don't have any groups from Somerset County, so we will be the first group if that were done. And so there's still quite a few details that have to be discussed, so we'll be getting additional information. Second thing they mentioned, and it actually happened last week, was the youth summit. Took place May 7th and 8th at William Allen. I know that the grad student group did a skit one of the days, I think the 7th. The students at William Allen also saw 2 videos about substance abuse. One of them was a post-heroin video, and the other one was called In a Split Second. On May 13th, there was a booth at Bridge, and it was pilots and nurses from the North Star Medevac, and those are the same people that do the every 15 minutes program. And that was like a couple days before the senior prom. On June 2nd, there's going to be a pills to heroin assembly for the 9th and 10th graders at Bridge, and they have quite a few people on the panel, including some of the young people from the pills to heroin from the adult presentation, parents, a therapist, and the student assistance counselors from Bridge. The Municipal Alliance is holding follow-up presentations that as a result of the pills to heroin. On April 30th, there was one on underage drinking, parties, and laws. And the SROs from William Allen and Bridge gave an excellent presentation, and their PowerPoint went out in a special Friday folder last week. This week, on May 21st at 7 p.m. at the Town Hall, there's a presentation on what is addiction, and there's going to be a panel, a parent and some therapists are going to be here to talk about that. On June 11th, 7 p.m. at the Town Hall, Discipline and Recovery, we're going to have representatives from Al-Anon and Sunrise Detox. And the Twilight Challenge is on Sunday, June 1st.
Thank you, Linda.
The pills to heroin, 10th and 11th grade, the conference. the
I'm
panel,
sorry, it's 9th and 10th.
What are they going to do 11, 12? Have they done that already?
They did the Project 5 of the
But they did not do the panel.
No, they're not doing this one.
I'm surprised that was one of the more meaningful ones where you actually get to hear the students who were the young people who had the addiction problem. And I would think the 11th and 12th graders would be a much more advisable group to make their presentation to. So, my opinion anyway, very short-sighted to only do 9 and 10.
I think it was partly that it's very late in the year and there's AP tests and all this stuff, scheduling is hard, but also because they were having Project Pride, which some of those people who come have very similar stories, because that's how they got into trouble and got in jail in the first place, was the drug addiction. But I think that people feel it was pretty good to do for all the grades. I don't think people are deliberately avoiding doing
or just that you're missing this year's 12th graders. And I think that's the best program given so far. And to not do it, I think is an omission.
Okay, we are now up to public forum on other than agenda items. If there's anyone who has anything to say out there? Okay, we'll close public forum. We're up to board forum.
Can I just say I went to it was almost an accident, but I went to Montgomery County's school board's meeting. I thought it was a joint Somerset and Montgomery. I went anyway, and I happened to speak to the principal and,
Montgomery School District?
okay, did I say the wrong thing here?
It's in county, so I'm not sure if you meant.
Yeah,
Somerset County.
Somerset, no, what's the other county? Hunterton. Thank you. Hunterton. I'm tired and I have a headache, but I went there and they had attorneys presenting, and what they had was the school board had a meeting. I forgot the paperwork and I'm forgetting all the names and titles, but they described how to better deal with the cost of students with IEP. There was a school board's panel that happened with different members through the state and counties, and I'm sure you've already heard of it through other venues, but what they said and the attorneys said was to consolidate resources within multiple school districts to help reduce the cost. I think you may be already doing that, and if not, I'm sure the people in your administration have told you about it. And they did have quite a few other points, but I think we were doing a lot of it anyway, and we're using our staff fully mostly. And we intend to bring in consultants as opposed to hire them, because I don't think we have that issue. But that was an interesting presentation. And just as a side note, I didn't know it, but they give out awards for school board members. And if you have so many points for attending so many things, and then I just looked to see if I had the points. I had the points, but now you have to be a delegate too. So you know what that is. So I don't think anyone's been a delegate, right? So I think Susan Carlson did that. She did that. So you have to be a delegate. And they had all these awards for all their school. They're a very active school board in that county down there. So anyway, just sharing information. Go ahead. You said you were going to share information about the.
I know what you're talking about. That was the New Jersey School Boards Association did a review of possible ways to save money. And they put a report out. I already asked Jean to take a look at that about a month ago, and she came back with a couple of things that she thought that we might be able to do. So we're working on a couple of things that might help us save some money, but as far as the consolidation goes, we do that already in some cases in some of our special programs where we have one school that does a particular program to, keep the class sizes
There was a
manageable.
consolidating with.
They were talking about within the
Not
county.
just in our
Right,
school.
right. That's
That
a
we
whole
have to
nother
reach- that's a
set
whole
of
nother,
issues,
yeah.
right? See where that goes.
Anyone else? We're up to adjournment. Someone like to make a motion? Briefly, Susan?